I never thought buying a house in what was advertised as a peaceful, family-friendly gated community would turn into the most stressful chapter of my life. When you're signing paperwork, walking through model homes, and shaking hands with the realtor who swears up and down that the neighborhood is a little slice of heaven, you don't picture yourself months later pacing your driveway with your fists clenched, staring at thousands of dollars of damage on the one thing you care about most. But that's exactly where I ended up. See, when I bought this place, I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't the type to get into petty neighbor disputes, and I certainly wasn't someone who thought the hoe would even notice me. I worked long hours, I minded my business, and the only thing that really stood out about me in the neighborhood was my car. That car. Man, I still remember the day I drove it off the lot. Shiny black, flawless paint job, chrome rims that practically sparkled in the sunlight. A muscle car I'd dreamed about since I was a kid handing my dad wrenches in his old garage. I spent years saving for it. Side jobs, skipped vacations, cheap takeout dinners instead of eating out. When I finally bought it, it wasn't just a car. It was proof that I'd built something for myself. Every time I turned the key and heard that engine roar to life, it was like a victory lap. But not everyone saw it that way. From the moment I parked it in the driveway, there was one person who made it her personal mission to ruin my joy. Karen, my neighbor across the street. She wasn't technically the president of the HO, but you wouldn't know it from the way she strutted around like she owned every square foot of the subdivision. She was the self-appointed rule enforcer. Trash can left out too long? She'd pound on your door. Grass half an inch too high? Expect a nasty note in your mailbox. Christmas lights up past January? She'd show up in person, tapping her foot, demanding you take them down. I thought maybe she just liked to feel important. Maybe if I ignored her, she'd eventually get bored and move on. But the thing about people like Karen is, the moment they sense you're not fighting back, they double down. They push harder. They test the limits. And unfortunately for me, she decided my brand new car was the hill she was going to die on. The first encounter was almost laughable. I was out front polishing the hood, just enjoying the afternoon sun, when I heard the sharp clap of her sandals slapping against the pavement. She stormed over with that trademark scowl plastered on her face. "That thing doesn't belong here," she said, folding her arms. I looked up, cloth in hand. "Sorry, what?" She gestured dramatically at the car. "This is a family neighborhood, not a racetrack. HOAs don't allow, whatever this is, junk vehicles sitting out in driveways." I actually laughed at that. I couldn't help it. The car was fresh off the lot, gleaming under the sun. No scratches, no rust, no nothing. A junk vehicle? Please. But she wasn't joking. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice calm, "this is a brand new car. There's nothing junk about it. And last I checked, HO rules don't say anything about muscle cars." Her lips tightened into a thin line. Well, they should. Cars like this are noisy, disruptive, and an eyesore. You should consider keeping it in your garage. Better yet, sell it. I thought that was the end of it. Just another one of her power trip lectures. I shrugged, told her to have a nice day, and went back to polishing. But that conversation set the tone for everything that came after. Every time I pulled in, she was watching. If I let the engine idle for a minute, she'd come out to glare. More than once, I caught her peeking through her curtains like some kind of cartoon villain, just waiting for me to slip up. And then came the fake violation notices. One morning, I opened my mailbox to find an official-looking letterhead that said HO notice in bold at the top. It accused me of parking a prohibited vehicle in my driveway and warned me that further violations would result in fines. For a second, I panicked. I pulled out my HO handbook and combed through every line. Nothing. No mention of muscle cars. No mention of driveway restrictions beyond boats, RVs, and obviously inoperable Junkers. That's when I noticed the handwriting on the bottom of the page. It wasn't even signed by the board. It was scribbled in what looked like a rushed Sharpie. "You've been warned." And I recognized it. Karen's handwriting. Sloppy loops, heavy dots over the eyes. She hadn't even tried to disguise it. That was when I realized this wasn't just about rules. This was personal. She didn't like my car, she didn't like me, and she wasn't going to stop until she made my life miserable. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But ignoring someone like Karen only works for so long. And eventually, she escalated in a way that crossed the line so far there was no going back. It was a Tuesday morning. The sun was barely up. I grabbed my coffee, slung my bag over my shoulder, and headed out to the driveway. At first, everything looked normal. Then I got closer. My stomach twisted. My coffee slipped right out of my hand, hitting the pavement and splattering everywhere. The entire driver's side of my car was caved in a massive dent stretched across the door, jagged creases cutting through the smooth black paint. It wasn't a scratch. It wasn't a ding. This was deliberate. Someone had taken something heavy and slammed it into the car over and over until the metal folded in on itself. I staggered closer, hoping maybe my eyes were playing tricks. That's when I saw the streaks of paint. White paint. Faint. Smeared across the dented black surface. And across the street, there it was. Karen's white SUV, parked crooked in her driveway. I froze. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe someone else had done this and the paint transfer was just bad luck. But then I looked up, and there she was. Karen, standing on her porch, arms folded, watching me. Watching me like she had been waiting for me to find it. And worst of all, she was smiling. That smile lit a fire in me I can't even explain. My hands shook as I marched across the street. "Karen," I snapped, "did you hit my car?" She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about." "The dent," I said, pointing back at it. "The paint. It matches your SUV. You can't seriously think I won't put two and two together." Her smirk widened. "Maybe if you didn't leave that obnoxious thing sitting out there like a trophy, accidents wouldn't happen." Accidents. She called it an accident, as if someone repeatedly slamming into my car was just one of those things. "You're going to pay for the damages," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. And then she laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not a dismissive laugh. A sharp, ugly laugh that echoed across the street. "Good luck proving it. You don't have cameras. You don't have witnesses. And the hoe? They already agree with me that your car doesn't belong here. Honestly, I did you a favor. A favor." She smashed my brand new car and told me it was a favor. I stood there in silence for a moment, staring at her, my fists clenched so tight my knuckles ached. Every instinct in me wanted to yell, to call the cops, to raise hell until the entire neighborhood gathered around. But then I remembered something my dad used to say when he was elbow deep in an engine, and something wasn't going right. He'd pause, wipe the sweat off his forehead, and say, "Don't force it. Be patient. You'll get it done the right way." So I swallowed the rage boiling in my chest. I turned without another word, walked back across the street, and stood beside my wrecked car, breathing hard. But in my mind, a plan was already forming. Because if Karen thought she could destroy what I'd worked so hard for and get away with it, she had another thing coming. She thought she'd won. She thought the lack of cameras and the complacency of the home meant I was powerless. But I wasn't. I knew her weakness. She worshipped that white SUV of hers, treated it like it was some kind of luxury prize, even though it was just a mid-range crossover with a cheap aftermarket trim kit. She'd wash it twice a week, wax it every month, brag to the other ladies about how spotless she kept it. That SUV was her pride and joy, just like my car was mine. And if she wanted to play dirty, well, I could play too. What Karen didn't know was that I had a friend who ran a towing company. We'd been buddies since high school, and I'd helped him out more than once when he was getting started, free labor, cash loans, the works. He always told me, "You ever need something moved, you call me. No questions asked." So as I stood there staring at the dent in my car, I pulled out my phone, scrolled to his name, and hit call. When he picked up, I didn't even say hello. I just said, "I've got a job for you, and you're going to love this one." When I hung up the phone with my buddy, my hands were still trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer force of keeping my temper bottled up. Every time I glanced back at that massive dent in my car, The rage bubbled back up to the surface, threatening to spill over. But instead of storming back across the street and doing something stupid, I focused on the one thought that calmed me down. Karen's smug little grin would be wiped clean off her face very, very soon. My buddy's name was Mike. We'd known each other since we were teenagers. He was one of those guys who didn't do college, didn't do office jobs, didn't care for rules. He just loved trucks, and he had turned that love into a business. A few years back, when he was struggling to get his towing company off the ground, I'd pitched in however I could. Extra cash, helping with paperwork, even riding along on late-night calls when he needed someone to keep him awake. We had that kind of friendship where favors weren't forgotten. So when I told him what Karen had done, he didn't hesitate. "What's the address?" he asked, already revving his engine on the other end of the line. I gave him the details, and his laugh rumbled through the phone. "Say no more. I'll be there in 20. When I hung up, I walked back inside to pace the living room. My heart was racing, not just from anger, but from adrenaline. This was reckless. This was risky. But sometimes you've got to fight fire with fire, and Karen had lit the match. From the window, I kept one eye on her. She hadn't gone back inside. She was still on her porch, sipping her iced coffee, smirking at me like she thought she'd already won. Every sip was a taunt, every glance in my direction a reminder of what she'd taken from me. I whispered to myself, "Keep laughing, Karen. Just keep laughing." About 25 minutes later, I heard it, the low rumble of a diesel engine coming down the street. My pulse spiked as Mike's tow truck appeared, bright yellow with his company logo on the side. He pulled up casually, like this was just another job. No rush, no drama. But when he rolled down his window and looked at me, the grin on his face told me he already understood the deliciousness of this situation. "This the one?" he asked, jerking his chin toward Karen's SUV. "Oh yeah," I said, stepping closer. "That's the one." Karen had been watching too. At first, I don't think she realized what was happening. She narrowed her eyes, tilting her head like she was trying to figure out why a tow truck was idling in front of her house. But when Mike hopped out, heavy boots thumping against the pavement, and started pulling chains and hooks from the side compartment, it finally clicked. She slammed her cup down on the porch railing so hard I thought the glass would shatter. "Excuse me," she screeched, storming down her steps. "What do you think you're doing?" Mike didn't even look up. "Got a job order. Vehicles being towed." Simple as that. "Job order?" she shrieked, her voice already hitting that glass-shattering pitch. "From who? I didn't call for a tow. You can't just touch my car." That was my cue. I stepped forward, arms crossed, trying to keep my face calm, even though my heart was pounding. "Karen, you damaged my property. Remember? That big dent in my car you called a favor? Well, I figured I'd return the favor. And lucky for me, I've got connections." Her mouth fell open, her face turning an alarming shade of red. You can't just take my SUV. That's theft. That's a crime." Mike finally looked up at her, utterly unfazed. "Lady, I've been doing this job for 10 years. Trust me, if I'm hooking this up, it's because I can. You don't want to argue with the paperwork." Of course, there was no paperwork. Not the official kind, anyway. But Karen didn't know that, and Mike had the kind of authority in his voice that made people second-guess themselves. She spun on me, jabbing a finger in my direction. "You think this is funny? You think you can humiliate me like this? I'll have the hoe fine you so hard you'll wish you never moved here." I let out a low laugh, shaking my head. "The hoe? You mean the same people who've been letting you get away with fake violation notices and harassment for months?" "Yeah, good luck with that." By then, Mike already had the hooks secured around the back wheels. With a smooth, practiced motion, he cranked the lever, and Karen's beloved white SUV lifted off the ground. The sight of it tilting upward, helpless, was more satisfying than I can possibly describe. Karen lost it. She rushed forward, grabbing at the tow rig, screaming at Mike to stop. But Mike was built like a linebacker, and he didn't even flinch. "Ma'am, step back before you hurt yourself," he said flatly, like he'd delivered that line 1,000 times before. "You can't do this. "That's my car," she wailed, her voice cracking. "And that," I said calmly, nodding toward my dented black muscle car across the street, "was my car. But you didn't care when you wrecked it, did you? You smiled. You laughed. You told me it was a favor. So guess what, Karen? I'm doing you a favor too, teaching you a lesson about actions and consequences." The neighbors had started to gather by then. You know how it is. Something unusual happens in a quiet neighborhood, and suddenly half the street is peeking through blinds or stepping out onto porches. People whispered to each other, pointing at Karen, at me, at the SUV dangling helplessly behind the tow truck. And if I'm being honest, I loved every second of it. Because for once, Karen wasn't the one controlling the narrative. For once, she was the one being humiliated in front of everyone. She screamed so loudly I thought her voice would give out. "This is illegal. This is harassment. I'll call the police." "Go ahead," I said, shrugging. "Tell them how you smashed up my brand new car and then laughed in my face. Tell them how you've been forging HOA notices and slipping them in my mailbox. Let's see how well that plays out for you." Her jaw snapped shut so fast I could almost hear her teeth click. She knew I had her cornered. Sure, she could bluff, but deep down, she knew I wasn't lying. She had pushed her luck too far. By the time Mike climbed back into the cab of his truck and started the engine, Karen was standing there in the middle of the street, shaking, speechless. Her SUV was lifted and secured, ready to be hauled away. "Where to?" Mike asked me through the open window, grinning. I thought for a moment, then smirked. "Take it off the property. Anywhere but here. She'll figure it out." Karen lunged forward, as if she could somehow stop the truck with her bare hands. But Mike shifted gears, and the tow truck rumbled forward, dragging her precious SUV with it. She stumbled back, screaming obscenities, tears welling in her eyes, as the vehicle disappeared down the street. And I just stood there, arms folded, soaking it all in. For the first time since I'd moved into that neighborhood, I felt like I had the upper hand. Karen wasn't untouchable anymore. She wasn't the queen of the block. She was just a woman standing in the middle of the road, red-faced and powerless, while everyone watched. The satisfaction was overwhelming. But even as I stood there basking in it, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds and move on. No, this was the beginning of something bigger. And if she thought I'd played my last card, she was dead wrong. The silence after Mike's tow truck disappeared down the street was almost eerie. Karen just stood there in the middle of the road, fists balled up, chest heaving, face blotchy red. For once, she didn't have a comeback. For once, she didn't have the words to fill the air with her usual shrieking tirades. I should have taken comfort in that silence. I should have savored it longer. But I knew Karen too well. That woman wasn't the type to let something go. She was the kind who clung to grudges like they were lifelines. The kind who'd rather burn the whole house down than admit she'd lost. As I turned to head back into my house, her voice finally broke through the stillness, sharp and venomous. "You'll regret this," she hissed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You think you're clever? You think you've embarrassed me? You've just declared war." I didn't even bother responding. I gave her a half smile, the kind that said, "You've already lost," and shut my front door behind me. Inside, I leaned against the doorframe, exhaling deeply. My hands were still trembling, but this time it wasn't from rage, it was from adrenaline. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt like I wasn't the victim. I had taken control. But the victory glow didn't last long. By that evening, the fallout began. It started with the hoe. Around 7 p.m., I heard the knock on my door. A polite knock, not the angry pounding I'd come to expect from Karen. When I opened it, 3 people stood there, clipboards in hand, fake smiles plastered across their faces. The president, a balding guy named Ron who always wore polo shirts tucked too tightly into his khakis, cleared his throat. "Good evening," he said, his voice dripping with that artificial friendliness people put on when they're about to say something you won't like. "We've had a situation reported by your neighbor across the street." I raised my eyebrows, leaning against the frame. "Let me guess. She told you I stole her car. Ron shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the two board members behind him. Well, those were her words, yes. She claims you arranged for her vehicle to be removed illegally. This is a serious accusation. I couldn't help it. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the sheer audacity of Karen trying to spin this into me being the villain was so on brand it was almost predictable. You want to talk serious accusations? I said. Why don't we talk about the massive dent in my brand new car? Why don't we talk about the white paint that just so happens to match her SUV? Or the fake violation notices she's been stuffing in my mailbox? Did she mention any of that when she came crying to you? Ron frowned, pretending to jot something on his clipboard. We've heard complaints on both sides. Complaints? I snapped, my voice rising. One of us is making baseless complaints. The other has thousands of dollars of damage sitting in his driveway right now. Don't you dare pretend this is a both sides issue. The two board members behind him exchanged nervous glances. They weren't used to anyone pushing back. Normally, people just rolled over when the hoe came knocking. But I wasn't about to play that game. Not anymore. Ron cleared his throat again. Look, we don't want to escalate things further. But if this kind of vigilantism continues, we'll have no choice but to issue fines. Fines? I said, shaking my head with disbelief. You want to fine me for protecting my property? For standing up to a bully who's been harassing me since the day I moved in? If that's how you want to play it, fine. But I'll be at the next board meeting with photos, evidence, and maybe even a police report if it comes to that. And then we'll see who looks bad. The smug confidence drained from his face. The other two shuffled awkwardly, clearly eager to move on. Ron gave a stiff nod, muttered something about reviewing the situation, and they turned and walked away. I closed the door and leaned against it again, my jaw tight. They weren't on my side, but they weren't fully on hers either. Not yet. And I knew Karen well enough to know she wouldn't stop with the hoe. Sure enough, the next morning, the police showed up. Two officers standing in my driveway, knocking politely on the door. I opened it, already bracing myself. "Good morning, sir," one of them said. "We received a report of a possible vehicle theft connected to this address." I actually laughed out loud. "Let me guess, Karen called you?" The officers exchanged a look. "We can't disclose the reporting party, but we'd like to hear your side." So I walked them through it. Every detail. The dent in my car, the white paint, Karen's smug confession about doing me a favor, the fake violation letters, and finally, the tow. I didn't sugarcoat anything. They listened quietly, taking notes. When I finished, one of them asked, "Do you have any evidence of the damage?" I led them to the driveway, pointing at the massive dent in my car. They leaned in, inspecting the white paint streaks. One of them nodded. "Looks consistent with a white SUV. Do you have photos of her vehicle before it was towed?" I smiled. "Better than that. Half the neighborhood saw it. And I've already texted a few neighbors who said they'd be willing to make statements. You'll have witnesses." That seemed to shift their demeanor. They exchanged another glance, this one more cautious. Finally, the older officer sighed. "All right. At this point, it looks like this is more of a civil matter than criminal. If you'd like, you can file a formal report for the damage to your car. As for the tow, unless she can prove ownership and wrongful removal, that'll also fall under civil disputes." Translation, I said dryly. "She wasted your time." The officer gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Let's just say we've been out to this neighborhood before. More than once." That was all I needed to hear. They weren't going to arrest me. They weren't going to drag me into some nightmare legal battle. They were going to file the paperwork and move on. When they left, I felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. Because about an hour later, Karen stormed back over, pounding on my door like a madwoman. I opened it just enough to lean against the frame, blocking her view inside. "Can I help you?" I asked calmly. "You think you're clever," she spat, her face twisted with fury. "Calling the cops on me? Lying to the hoe? Making me look like some kind of criminal?" I raised an eyebrow. "I didn't have to make you look like a criminal, Karen. You did that all by yourself." Her voice rose to a scream. "I'll ruin you. You hear me? You won't last a year in this neighborhood." I didn't flinch. Funny. That's exactly what I thought about you. I shut the door in her face, her shrieks muffled as she continued to scream on my porch for another full minute before storming off. That night, I sat in my living room, staring at the dent in my car through the window. My satisfaction from towing her SUV had been sweet, but fleeting. Karen wasn't backing down. If anything, she was doubling down. And I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She'd made it clear she was willing to escalate. So the question became, was I? Because if I was going to survive in this neighborhood, I couldn't just defend myself. I had to make sure Karen understood once, and for all that messing with me would cost her more than she was willing to pay. And the next move? That was going to be mine. The funny thing about revenge is, once you taste it, you start to crave more. When Mike hauled Karen's SUV off the property, the rush of satisfaction was like nothing I'd felt in years. Watching her stomp her feet in the middle of the street while her pride and joy vanished into the distance, that image stayed burned in my mind like a favorite photograph. But as sweet as it was, I knew deep down it wasn't enough. Karen wasn't the kind of person you could humiliate once and expect her to stop. She was relentless. Like a wasp you swat at, but don't kill. She just comes back angrier, buzzing louder, stinging harder. I'd spent enough time around her to know that her next move was already brewing, probably while she sat in her living room fuming, staring at the empty spot where her SUV usually sat. So, I started thinking ahead. The dent in my car wasn't going to fix itself. And as much as I wanted to focus on punishing Karen, the reality was that I had a mess to clean up. I got a couple of estimates from body shops, and each one hit me like a punch to the gut. 4,000, 5,000, even higher. My insurance would cover part of it, but without proof of who did it, they weren't going after Karen's policy. And that's when it clicked. If I wanted to hit Karen where it really hurt, it wasn't just about embarrassing her. It was about making sure she paid. Literally. Now, Karen had always strutted around like she was rolling in money. Expensive-looking handbags, salon appointments twice a week, and that SUV she treated like a luxury vehicle, even though it was just an average model with chrome trim. But people like Karen usually aren't as flush as they pretend. Most of the time, it's smoke and mirrors, credit cards maxed out, home equity loans stretched thin, everything about appearances. So what would happen if suddenly her perfect image started costing her more than she could handle? That was the seed of my plan. But before I could make it grow, Karen made her next move. 2 days after the tow, I woke up to find a bright orange slip taped to my front door. At first, I thought it was another one of her fake violation notices, but when I peeled it off and read it, my stomach twisted. This one wasn't fake. It was real. Stamped, signed, and sealed by the HOA board. Notice of violation. Unauthorized vehicle storage. It read. I laughed bitterly. They were actually trying to find me for parking my car in my own driveway. The irony was almost laughable, considering Karen had parked her SUV outside for years without a single problem. But of course, rules don't apply to her, only to the people she doesn't like. That evening, I showed up at the HOA office, violation slip in hand. The office was just a converted garage at the clubhouse, with filing cabinets lining the walls and the smell of stale coffee in the air. Ron, the polo shirt king himself, sat behind a folding table covered in paperwork. I want to contest this, I said, slapping the notice down in front of him. Ron sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Look, I don't want to escalate things between you and Karen any further. Escalate? I interrupted, my voice sharp. She smashed my car. She forged violation letters. She's been harassing me since the day I moved in. And now you're siding with her? No, I'm not paying a dime for this nonsense. He shifted uncomfortably. We've had multiple complaints about your vehicle. From who? I demanded. Let me guess. Karen. And Karen alone. Ron hesitated, which told me everything I needed to know. I leaned closer, lowering my voice. You know what I think, Ron? I think Karen's got all of you wrapped around her finger. Maybe she bribes you with cookies at Christmas. Maybe she threatens to sue if she doesn't get her way. But either way, you're letting her weaponize the hoe to attack people she doesn't like. And I'm telling you right now, I'm not going to roll over. You find me for this, I'll fight it. And when I fight it, I'll bring every shred of evidence I've got. Photos of my car, witness statements from neighbors, even the police report. Do you really want that circus at your next board meeting? Ron's face paled slightly. He mumbled something about reviewing the case and waved me out of the office. Walking back home, I felt a surge of determination. If Karen wanted to drag the hoe into this, fine. Two could play that game. But I wasn't going to play defense anymore. I was going on offense. That night, I sat at my computer and started typing. I wrote a detailed account of everything that had happened since I moved in, every fake notice, every confrontation, the damage to my car, even the police visit. I attached photos of the dent, close-ups of the white paint, and screenshots of text messages from neighbors who'd offered to back me up. By the time I was done, it looked less like a complaint and more like a legal brief. Then I emailed it, not just to the hoe board, but to the entire neighborhood mailing list. Every homeowner, every family, every single person who had ever rolled their eyes at Karen's antics but stayed quiet because they didn't want to be her next target. If Karen wanted to make this war public, I was more than happy to oblige. The fallout was immediate. By the next morning, my inbox was flooded with replies. Some were sympathetic. We've had problems with her too. Thanks for speaking up. Others were cautious, worried about rocking the boat. But the best ones were the angry ones, people who had their own stories of Karen's harassment, stories they'd been sitting on for years. She'd fined one guy for improper holiday decorations. She'd accused another family's teenage son of vandalism with zero proof. She'd even called animal control on a sweet elderly couple because their dog barked twice in one afternoon. It was like pulling a thread and watching the whole sweater unravel. By the end of the week, Karen wasn't just fighting me. She was fighting the entire neighborhood. I'd see her storming down the street, waving her arms, trying to argue with neighbors who now avoided her like the plague. Her voice, once so commanding, now sounded shrill and desperate. She was losing her grip on the one thing she cared about more than anything: control. And I wasn't done yet. See, my friend Mike still had her SUV in impound. He called me a few days later, chuckling into the phone. You'll never believe this. She came down here raising hell, demanding I release her car. Said she was gonna sue me, sue you, sue the whole city if she had to. I grinned. What'd you tell her? He laughed harder. Told her unless she paid the fees, towing, storage, everything, she wasn't getting it back. She stormed out swearing she'd have my license revoked. Good luck with that. By the time Karen finally scraped together the cash to get her SUV back, the bill was nearly $2,000. Watching her drive at home days later, her face red with rage, was like watching someone drag themselves out of quicksand, angry, humiliated, and a whole lot poorer. But here's the thing about people like Karen. Money isn't the only thing they care about. They care about reputation, about power, about being the loudest voice in the room. And now that her grip on the hoe was slipping, I knew she was going to come at me even harder. So I prepared. I installed cameras around my property, high definition, motion activated, covering every angle of my driveway and yard. If she so much as looked at my car the wrong way again, I'd have evidence. I talked to neighbors, building alliances, making it clear that if she tried to retaliate, she'd be dealing with more than just me. For the first time since moving in, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells. I felt ready. And deep down, I could tell Karen knew it too. Because the next time our eyes met across the street, she didn't smirk. She didn't glare. She just looked at me with something I hadn't seen before: fear. If Part 4 felt like the first real victory in this war, Part 5 is where the cracks in Karen's empire started to show. And trust me, it was a sight worth remembering. After my neighborhood email went out, Karen was a shadow of her former self. Gone were the smug little struts across her lawn, the way she used to bark at kids riding bikes too close to her driveway, the constant waving of her clipboard like she was the self-appointed sheriff of the block. Instead, she was quieter, almost jittery. But the thing about Karen, quiet never lasts. Quiet is just the calm before her storm. The first storm came the very next HOA board meeting. Now, normally these meetings were dull affairs, half the seats empty, a handful of retirees complaining about weeds in the common area, Ron droning on about budget line items. But after my email, the place was packed. People who hadn't shown up in years suddenly had plenty to say. I didn't even have to rally them. They came on their own, emboldened by the fact that someone had finally stood up to Karen. I walked in with a manila folder under my arm, printouts of everything I'd sent in the email, plus a few extra photos for good measure. When Karen saw me, her eyes narrowed into slits. She was sitting at the front table next to Ron, her lips pressed so tight they almost disappeared. The meeting started normally enough, but it didn't take long before voices started rising. One neighbor stood up, pointing directly at Karen. "Why are we letting her run the hoe like it's her personal fiefdom? She fined me last year for planting flowers that were the wrong color." "Flowers? Who cares what color my daisies are?" Another woman chimed in. "She called animal control on my dog 3 times. 3. My dog's a 10-year-old lab that barely moves from the couch." The room buzzed with murmurs, people nodding, others speaking up with their own stories. For once, I didn't have to lead the charge. I just sat there, watching Karen squirm in her seat as the tidal wave of complaints crashed down on her. Finally, I stood. I didn't raise my voice, didn't need to. The room was already listening. "I moved here for peace," I said, holding up a photo of my dented car. "Instead, I've been harassed, fined, lied to, and had my property damaged. And when I finally stood up for myself, I pointed straight at Karen, ran crying to the hoe, to the police, to anyone who'd listen. But what she didn't count on was all of you. Because I'm not the only one she's done this to." "Am I?" A chorus of "no" filled the room. Karen shot up from her seat, her face red as a beet. "This is slander," she screeched. "None of this is true. You're all exaggerating. You're all just jealous because I actually care about this community." Her voice cracked on the last word, and that was all it took. Laughter rippled through the room. The queen bee was losing her sting. Ron banged his gavel, trying to regain control, but the damage was done. The meeting ended with promises of further review and potential reforms, but everyone knew the real outcome. Karen's grip on the hoe was slipping fast. That should have been enough. For most people, it would have been. But Karen wasn't most people. When she felt her power slipping, she didn't back down. She lashed out. And lash out she did. 2 nights later, at around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud bang outside. Heart racing, I grabbed my phone and checked the live feed from my security cameras. And there she was, Karen, standing in my driveway. She was holding something, a bottle of some kind, and waving it near my car. For a split second, panic seized me. Was she trying to set it on fire? Dump chemicals on it? I zoomed in. It wasn't gasoline, thank God. It was a bottle of soda, the cheap kind from the dollar store. She was pouring it across the hood of my freshly repaired car, muttering to herself like some kind of deranged witch casting a curse. At first, I didn't know whether to laugh or call the cops. But then she upped the ante. She pulled out a roll of toilet paper and started draping it across my roof, my bushes, even the mailbox. Like a teenager on Halloween. Only she wasn't a teenager. She was a grown woman in her 50s, sneaking around in slippers at 2 a.m., TPing her neighbor's house out of spite. I hit record, making sure every second was saved. Then I quietly called the non-emergency police line. By the time the patrol car pulled up, Karen was still at it, humming to herself as she tied a final strand of toilet paper into a sloppy bow on my tree. The officers stepped out, shining their flashlights. "Ma'am," one said, "what exactly are you doing?" Karen froze like a deer in headlights. I was just, this is a prank. A harmless prank." They didn't look convinced. Especially when I came outside, holding up my phone. "Got the whole thing on camera," I said, my voice calm. "Including her pouring soda on my car." Karen's face drained of color. She stammered something about community spirit and misunderstandings, but it was no use. The officers took my statement, warned her about trespassing, and told her if it happened again, she'd be facing charges. As they led her back across the street, She shot me a look of pure hatred. But beneath the hatred, I saw something else. Desperation. Because deep down, she knew she'd lost. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood transformed. Without Karen's constant nagging, people started relaxing. Kids played in the cul-de-sacs again. Neighbors actually waved to each other instead of keeping their heads down. It was like a weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. And Karen? She grew quieter. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. The HOA was reviewing her position. The police had her on record for trespassing, and her reputation was in tatters. But I knew Karen. I knew this wasn't the end. People like her don't just fade away gracefully. They cling to whatever scraps of power they can, no matter how pathetic it makes them look. And I was right. Because one evening, just as the sun was setting, I saw her standing at the end of her driveway, staring at me. Not yelling. Not throwing tantrums. Just staring. I stared back, refusing to look away. And in that silent standoff, I realized something. This war wasn't just about cars or fines or HOA rules. It was about control. About who got to live peacefully and who had to live in fear. And as long as I lived in that neighborhood, I wasn't going to be the one living in fear. You'd think after being caught red-handed pouring soda on my car and toilet papering my house like a sulky teenager, Karen would have finally backed off. Any normal person would have taken the embarrassment, the police warning, and the neighborhood's collective disgust as a sign to retreat. But Karen? Normal was never part of her vocabulary. If anything, that humiliating night lit a fire under her. For a couple of weeks, things were eerily quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you suspicious every time you walk past the window. I kept checking my cameras, expecting to catch her skulking around again. But there was nothing. No late-night antics. No screaming matches in the street. Just silence. But silence, in Karen's world, always meant one thing. She was plotting. And sure enough, the storm hit. It started with a letter. Not a fake HOA violation this time, but an official-looking envelope with a law firm's logo stamped across the top. My stomach tightened as I opened it. Inside was a letter filled with legal jargon, accusing me of harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. According to the letter, I had engaged in a pattern of malicious behavior against my neighbor, causing her significant emotional trauma. It demanded that I cease and desist all further actions or face a civil lawsuit. I couldn't help it. I laughed. Loud and long. The audacity of Karen, trying to spin this entire fiasco as if I had been the aggressor, was almost impressive. She smashed my car. She faked HOA violations. She called the cops on me. She trashed my property in the middle of the night. And now she wanted to sue me for emotional distress? But as much as I laughed, I knew I couldn't just ignore it. Even bogus legal threats can get messy if you don't handle them properly. So I did what she never expected me to do. I lawyered up. My cousin recommended an attorney, sharp, no nonsense, the kind of guy who could spot a frivolous lawsuit from a mile away. When I handed him the letter, he smirked. "This is weak," he said, flipping through the pages. "Looks like she hired one of those pay-by-the-hour firms that'll send a threatening letter to anyone if you throw them a few $100. It's not worth the paper it's printed on. So what do we do?" I asked. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. We hit back. Hard. We draft a response outlining her harassment, her vandalism, the police reports, the HOA complaints. We make it clear that if she wants to play this game, she'll be opening herself up to a countersuit that'll cost her more than she can afford. That was music to my ears. Within a week, my lawyer sent off the response. And just like that, Karen's legal threat vanished into thin air. No follow-up. No lawsuit. Nothing. She'd bluffed, and I'd called it. But Karen wasn't done yet. When the legal angle failed, she shifted to the smear campaign. Flyers started appearing in mailboxes around the neighborhood. Badly photocopied rents filled with accusations about me, that I was a danger to the community, that I bullied women, that I was destroying neighborhood harmony. Some of the flyers even had grainy, zoomed-in photos of me mowing my lawn or carrying groceries. like she thought she was building some kind of creepy case file. At first, I was furious, but then I realized something. Nobody was buying it. The neighbors she thought she could sway, they'd already seen the truth. They'd read my email, seen my evidence, watched her unravel at the last home meeting. The more she tried to paint me as the villain, the more pathetic she looked. People started bringing me the flyers, shaking their heads, saying things like, "Can you believe this?" And "She's lost it." It was backfiring beautifully. But Karen, stubborn as ever, kept escalating. The next home meeting was her last stand. She marched in with a thick binder, slamming it down on the table like it was filled with irrefutable proof of my supposed crimes. "This man," she declared, pointing a trembling finger at me, "is a menace to this community. He has stalked me, defamed me, and turned this neighborhood against me. I demand that the board take action immediately, expulsion, fines, whatever it takes." The room went silent. Then Ron, the usually spineless president, cleared his throat. "Karen, we've reviewed the evidence, and frankly, it's lacking. What isn't lacking are the multiple complaints we've received about your behavior. The police report, the trespassing incident, the vandalism. That was a prank," she snapped. "And the numerous accounts from neighbors about your harassment," he continued firmly. "At this point, the board has decided it's in the best interest of the community to remove you from your position." The gasp that rippled through the room was followed by scattered applause. Karen's eyes widened in horror. "You can't do this. I am this hoe. You'd all be living in squalor without me." But it was over. The vote passed swiftly, almost unanimously. Karen was officially stripped of her hoe power. I wish I could say she accepted it gracefully, but of course, this was Karen. She stormed out, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows, shrieking about conspiracies and betrayal. And just like that, the neighborhood was free. But freedom, I soon learned, doesn't come without a cost. Because even after losing her hoe throne, Karen wasn't done with me. Over the next few days, I noticed strange things. My garbage cans knocked over when the rest of the streets were untouched. Small scratches on my mailbox. A nail suspiciously placed in my driveway, just waiting for a tire to roll over it. They were petty, cowardly moves. The kind you couldn't prove in court, but you knew in your gut had her fingerprints all over them. And that's when I realized something important. Karen didn't need power to cause chaos. She didn't need titles or votes or hoe backing. All she needed was spite. Pure, undiluted spite. And if I was going to survive in this neighborhood long term, I had to do more than win battles. I had to end the war. Because as satisfying as it was to watch her lose her hoe crown, I knew in my bones Karen wasn't finished. Not yet. When Karen lost her hoe throne, I thought I'd finally get a break. For weeks, I'd dreamed of that exact moment. Her power stripped away, her clipboard useless, her voice drowned out by the same neighbors she'd tormented for years. And when it finally happened, it was glorious. The look on her face when Ron announced her removal was burned into my memory like a victory trophy. But the thing about people like Karen is, they don't just stop. Losing doesn't humble them. It twists them, hardens them, makes them even more dangerous. And I learned that lesson fast. It started small. A toppled garbage can here, a mysteriously scratched mailbox there. Things I couldn't prove, but knew in my gut were her doing. At first, I ignored them. I told myself she was lashing out like a cornered animal, that she'd burn herself out eventually. But then came the nails. 3 nails, perfectly lined up at the end of my driveway. I caught them just in time, glinting in the morning sun before I backed out. If I'd missed them, I would have blown out a tire. Maybe 2. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. That's when I knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. I had 2 choices. Wait for her to make a mistake big enough for the police to actually do something, or take control myself. And after months of being her target, I wasn't about to play defense anymore. I was going on the offensive. The question was, how do you take down someone like Karen permanently? You can't reason with her. You can't out-yell her. You can't shame her because she thrives on conflict. No, The only way to stop Karen was to cut her off at the knees, take away the tools she used to terrorize everyone. So I started digging. Late at night, after work, I sat at my computer combing through public records. Property records, court filings, anything with her name attached. It didn't take long to find gold. Karen, for all her posturing about being the queen of the neighborhood, was drowning in debt. Multiple liens on her property, late tax payments, even a lawsuit from a credit card company. It all started to make sense. The flashy handbags, the constant need to fine people for trivial violations, the desperation to hold onto her whole position. It wasn't about power alone. It was about money. She'd been using the hoe like her personal piggy bank, squeezing homeowners for petty fines just to keep her head above water. And now, without that steady stream of cash, she was flailing. I sat back in my chair, a smile creeping across my face. Because now I had leverage. But leverage alone wasn't enough. If I went after her directly with this info, she'd just scream harassment again, maybe even double down on the legal threats. No, I had to be smarter. I had to let Karen's own behavior be the nail in her coffin. So I made a plan. Step 1. Gather allies. I went back to the neighbors who'd emailed me after my first neighborhood-wide message. The guy with the flower finds, the woman with the elderly lab, the couple who'd been accused of vandalism. I invited them over one evening, laid out everything I'd found about Karen's debts, and asked one simple question. Are you ready to end this? They didn't even hesitate. Step 2. Document everything. We started compiling a master file. Every fake violation notice, every petty fine, every complaint she'd lodged against people with zero evidence. I added my own photos and video recordings. We even pooled together receipts from repairs neighbors had to make after her harassment campaigns, thousands of dollars worth. Step 3. Deliver the knockout blow. The next HOA meeting was only a week away. Even though Karen was stripped of her board position, she still showed up, trying to stir the pot, desperate to claw her way back into relevance. That night, the room was packed again, tension thick in the air. Karen stood up, binder in hand, launching into another rant about neighborhood decline and irresponsible homeowners. That's when I stood too. Funny you should mention responsibility, I said loudly, cutting her off mid-sentence. All eyes turned to me. I held up a thick stack of papers. Because I've been doing some research. And it seems our former board member hasn't exactly been practicing what she preaches. The room buzzed with whispers. Karen's face went pale. That's private, she shrieked. You have no right. Public record, I said smoothly. Tax liens, lawsuits, delinquent payments. Turns out, while she was nickel and diming all of us with bogus fines, she couldn't even keep her own finances in order. And here's the kicker, she's been reported for misuse of HOA funds. Multiple homeowners have evidence that fines were issued and paid, but never recorded properly in the books. Gasps echoed through the room. Karen lunged forward, practically foaming at the mouth. Lies, all lies, but it was too late. My allies began speaking up one by one, each holding their own evidence. The flower guy waving receipts, the dog owner with animal control reports, the vandalism couple showing photos. Piece by piece, we dismantled her. Ron finally banged his gavel, his voice firm for once. Karen, given the overwhelming evidence and the state of your conduct, the board will be filing an official complaint with county authorities. Effective immediately, you are barred from attending future meetings until this is resolved. The room erupted. Applause, cheers, even a few shouts of good riddance. Karen screamed, a sound so shrill it made the hairs on my arms stand up. She gathered her binder, papers flying everywhere, and stormed out, slamming the door so hard it cracked the frame. And just like that, the war shifted. Because Karen wasn't just humiliated anymore. She was exposed. The mask she'd worn for years, the queen of the neighborhood, the enforcer of rules, the self-righteous defender of community standards, was gone. Now everyone saw her for what she really was, a bitter, broke bully clinging to scraps of power she never deserved. I should have felt relief, and I did for a while. But as I walked home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't her final act. Karen had nothing left to lose now. No title, no money, no allies. And that made her more dangerous than ever. I thought I had seen the last of Karen the night she stormed out of that home meeting, binder clutched to her chest like it was some kind of shield. She'd been stripped of her title, humiliated in front of the whole community, and exposed for the fraud she was. Most people, after being cornered like that, would have packed up and moved. Maybe slink away in shame, maybe start fresh somewhere else. But this was Karen. She wasn't wired like normal people. No, Karen wasn't finished. The first clue came 2 nights later. I woke up to the sound of gravel crunching outside my window. My heart jumped into my throat. I pulled back the curtain just enough to see the faint glow of headlights cutting across my driveway. A car idled there for a moment, engine humming low, before slowly rolling away. I didn't get a plate number, didn't even see who was behind the wheel. But in my gut, I knew it was her. The next morning, I found a smear of ketchup across my mailbox. Not spray paint, not eggs, ketchup. A message, but one so bizarre it made me laugh. And that's the thing. She wasn't even trying to hurt me anymore. She was trying to rattle me, break me down with mind games. But she underestimated one thing. I was done playing defense. If she wanted a war, I'd finish it once and for all. It all came to a head the following weekend. I'd spent the day in the garage, polishing up the car Karen had once smashed, the same car that had started all of this chaos. Every time I ran the cloth over the hood, I remembered the sight of her SUV plowing into it, the smug look on her face, the way she thought she could get away with everything. I told myself I'd never let her take anything from me again. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, I heard it, a sharp, metallic clink, like a gas cap snapping shut. I froze, cloth in hand, ears straining. Then came footsteps, quick and light, moving toward the street. I bolted out of the garage just in time to see Karen's unmistakable orange jacket disappearing into the shadows. My eyes darted to my car. The gas cap was hanging loose. My blood ran cold. I sprinted forward, half expecting to see sugar or some other substance poured into the tank. But when I shined my phone light inside, it was clean. She hadn't done it yet. She'd been interrupted. That's when I realized she wasn't just pranking anymore. She was escalating. If she'd succeeded, my car could have been totaled. Maybe even dangerous to drive. I'd had enough. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my desk, flipping through the thick stack of evidence we'd compiled against her. And as I stared at it all, one thought kept cycling through my mind. Why should I wait for her to try again? Why should I give her another chance to hurt me or anyone else? No, this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about protection. So I picked up the phone and made some calls. The next morning, I went about my day like nothing had happened. Mowed the lawn, chatted with a couple of neighbors, washed the car again, just for good measure. And all the while, I kept one eye on Karen's house across the street. Sure enough, just after noon, her door swung open. Out she came, binder under her arm, phone pressed to her ear, barking orders to some poor soul on the other end. She marched to her driveway, climbed into her SUV, and started it up. And that's when the tow truck rolled in. It was a massive beast of a machine, bright yellow, with a hydraulic lift already extended. The driver didn't waste a second. He pulled right up in front of Karen's driveway, blocking her in. Karen slammed on her horn, leaning out the window to scream, but the driver didn't flinch. 2 uniformed officers stepped out of an unmarked car behind the tow truck. Karen's face drained of color. I stepped onto my porch, arms folded, and watched the whole thing unfold. "Ma'am," one officer said firmly, "we have a court order. This vehicle is being repossessed due to unpaid fines and liens." Karen shrieked. "No, this is harassment. This is my car." But the driver was already lowering the hydraulic lift, sliding it under her SUV. Metal groaned as the vehicle was hoisted off the ground. Karen scrambled out, waving her arms, begging, demanding, threatening all at once. "You can't do this. "Do you know who I am?" she screamed. The officer didn't even blink. "Yes, ma'am. That's why we're here." The neighbors started gathering, drawn by the commotion. Some recorded on their phones. Others whispered to each other. And for the first time in months, I saw it. The tide had turned completely. Nobody was afraid of her anymore. Nobody was buying the act. Karen was finished. As the tow truck pulled away, her SUV chained to the back, she collapsed on her lawn, screaming into the grass like a child. And I just stood there, calm, steady, not a word leaving my lips. Because this wasn't about shouting anymore. It wasn't about who could out-argue who or who could throw the nastiest punch. This was about patience, about letting Karen dig her own grave, and then making sure she never crawled out again. That night, the neighborhood was quiet. No more late-night engine noises. No more ketchup on mailboxes. No more binder-wielding tyrant pounding on doors. Just peace. And as I sat on my porch, sipping a cold beer, I realized something. Karen had wanted to control this neighborhood. She wanted to be feared, respected, obeyed. But in the end, all she earned was isolation. Her house went dark within a month. For sale sign planted in the yard, price dropping week after week until someone finally took it off her hands. Rumor had it she moved in with a relative 2 towns over, still ranting about how she'd been wronged, still playing the victim. But not here. Not anymore. Because this neighborhood wasn't hers to control. It was ours. And as for me, I finally got to enjoy the simple things again. Washing my car without looking over my shoulder. Walking down the street without being stalked by fake violations. Living in a place that felt like home instead of a battlefield. Karen was gone. The war was over. And I had won.